A selection from Stuart Little by E.B. White, read by Nelson Runger. The boys and girls crowded around the desk to look at the substitute. Everyone talked at once, and they seemed to be very much pleased. The girls giggled and the boys laughed, and everyone's eyes lit up with excitement to see such a small and good-looking teacher so appropriately dressed.
"Let me have your attention, please," repeated Stuart. "As you know, Miss Gunderson is sick, and I am taking her place."
"What's the matter with her?"
asked Roy Hart eagerly.
"Vitamin trouble," replied Stuart. "She took vitamin D when she needed A. She took B when she was short of C, and her system became overloaded with riboflavin, thiamine hydrochloride, and even with pyridoxine, the need for which in human nutrition has not been established. Let it be a lesson for all of us."
He glared fiercely at the children, and they made no more inquiries about Miss Gunderson.
"Everyone will now take his or her seat," commanded Stuart.
The pupils filed obediently down the aisles and dropped into their seats, and in a moment there was silence in the classroom. Stuart cleared his throat. Seizing a coat lapel in either hand, to make himself look like a professor, Stuart began.
"Anybody absent?"
The scholars shook their heads.
"Anybody late?"
They shook their heads.
"Very well," said Stuart. "What's the first subject you usually take up in the morning?"
"Arithmetic,"
shouted the children.
"Bother arithmetic," snapped Stuart. "Let's skip it."
There were wild shouts of enthusiasm at this suggestion. Everyone in the class seemed perfectly willing to skip arithmetic for one morning.
"What next do you study?" asked Stuart.
"Spelling,"
cried the children.
"Well," said Stuart, "a misspelled word is an abomination in the sight of everyone. I consider it a very fine thing to spell words correctly, and I strongly urge every one of you to buy a Webster's Collegiate Dictionary and consult it whenever you are in the slightest doubt. So much for spelling. What's next?"
The scholars were just as pleased to be let out of spelling as they were about arithmetic, and they shouted for joy, and everybody looked at everybody else and laughed and waved handkerchiefs and rulers, and some of the boys threw spitballs at some of the girls. Stuart had to climb onto the pile of books again and dive for the bell to restore order.
"What's next?" he repeated.
"Writing,"
cried the scholars.
"Goodness," said Stuart in disgust. "Don't you children know how to write yet?"
"Certainly we do,"
yelled one and all.
"So much for that, then," said Stuart.
"Social studies come next,"
cried Elizabeth Gardner eagerly.
"Social studies? Never heard of them," said Stuart. "Instead of taking up any special subject this morning, why wouldn't it be a good idea if we just talked about something?"
The scholars glanced around at each other in expectancy.
"Could we talk about the way it feels to hold a snake in your hand and then it winds itself around your wrist?"
asked Arthur Greenlaw.
"We could, but I'd rather not," replied Stuart.
"Could we talk about sin and vice?"
pleaded Lydia Lacey.
"Nope," said Stuart. "Try again."
"Could we talk about the fat woman at the circus and she had hair all over her chin?" begged Isidore Feinberg reminiscently.
"No," said Stuart. "I'll tell you. Let's talk about the king of the world."
He looked all around the room hopefully to see how the children liked that idea.
"There isn't any king of the world," said Harry Jameson in disgust. "What's the diff?" said Stuart. "There ought to be one."
"Kings are old-fashioned,"
said Harry. "Well, all right then. Let's talk about the chairman of the world. The world gets into a lot of trouble because it has no chairman. I would like to be chairman of the world myself."
"You're too small,"
said Mary Bendix.
"Oh, fish feathers," said Stuart. "Size has nothing to do with it. It's temperament and ability that count. The chairman has to have ability, and he must know what's important. How many of you know what's important?"
Up went all the hands.
"Very good," said Stuart.
cocking one leg across the other and shoving his hands in the pockets of his jacket.
"Henry Rackmeyer, you tell us what is important."
A shaft of sunlight at the end of a dark afternoon, a note in music, and the way the back of a baby's neck smells if its mother keeps it tidy," answered Henry.
"Correct," said Stuart. "Those are the important things. You forgot one thing, though. Mary Bendix, what did Henry Rackmeyer forget?"
"He forgot ice cream with chocolate sauce on it,"
said Mary quickly. "Exactly," said Stuart. "Ice cream is important. Well, now, if I'm going to be chairman of the world this morning, we've got to have some rules. Otherwise it will be too confusing with everyone running every which way and helping himself to things and nobody behaving. We've got to have some laws if we're going to play this game. Can anyone suggest any good laws for the world?"
Albert Fernstrom raised his hands.
"Don't eat mushrooms. They might be toadstools," suggested Albert. "That's not a law," said Stuart. "It's merely a bit of friendly advice. Very good advice, Albert. But advice and law are not the same. Law is much more solemn than advice. Law is extremely solemn. Anybody else think of a law for the world?"
"Nix on swiping anything," suggested John Poldowski solemnly.
"Very good," said Stuart. "Good law."
"Never poison anything but rats," said Anthony Brindisi.
"That's no good," said Stuart. "It's unfair to rats. A law has to be fair to everybody."
Anthony looked sulky. "But rats are unfair to us," he said. "Rats are objectionable."
"I know they are," said Stuart, "but from a rat's point of view, poison is objectionable. A chairman has to see all sides of a problem."
"Have you got a rat's point of view?" asked Anthony. "You look a little like a rat."
"No," replied Stuart. "I have more the point of view of a mouse, which is very different. I see things whole. It's obvious to me that rats are underprivileged. They've never been able to get out in the open."
"Rats don't like the open,"
said Agnes Baretska.
"That's because whenever they come out, somebody socks them. Rats might like the open if they were allowed to use it. Any other ideas for laws?"